Welcome back to the Great Compromise Podcast. I'm GOP Jim, and I've got Victoria the Democrat here with me. Are you ready to rumble today?
Oh, I'm ready. You're going down.
Excellent. So today, our topic is voter IDs. So what are voter IDs? Well, it just means that before you vote, you need to present proof of your identity. And now that sounds simple enough, but as it turns out, it's actually very controversial in the United States. So let's get into it. I am on the pro side this week. I support voter ID laws. Voter ID laws serve three core functions. They are checks against errors, they prevent wrongdoing, and they give citizens confidence in the voting process. Now, let's be honest. Confidence in our elections is at an all-time low. Whether or not that's based in reality doesn't even matter. The perception is that there is fraud or potential for interference. Reassuring the American people that we have secure elections is important. In our state's laws right now, only 15 states plus DC do not require an ID to vote. The rest do. That's 35 states that already require it. Opponents of voter IDs have long predicted that these policies would prevent hundreds of thousands of citizens in places like Texas and South Carolina from voting. Instead, we've seen record voter turnout in minority communities across the country. Besides the 35 states that require it, shall I list the countries that do too? Argentina, Brazil, Canada, France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Iceland, India, Israel, Italy, Mexico, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and of course others not on the list. I imagine they aren't all requiring IDs to suppress minorities from voting. It seems like voter IDs are a popular idea. In fact, extremely popular with the American people too. Polling from Politico, Marist, Gallup, Rasmussen, The Washington Post, and others regularly find that between 70% and 85% of Americans support voter ID requirements. I say we make IDs a federal requirement to vote, and then provide every citizen 18 and up an ID free of charge. That would be the perfect solution.
This week, I'm on the con side. I'm against voter ID laws. Let's start with some facts. 11%, or 30 million people in the U.S., do not have photo ID. This would exclude about 1 in 10 voters from casting a ballot. People with lower income are less likely to have a photo ID. 12% of adults in households that earn less than $25,000 in annual income lack photo ID, compared to 2% of households with an annual income of over $150,000. Young adults are also another population that are less likely to have photo ID. 15% of 17 to 20-year-olds don't have an ID. 11% of 21 to 24-year-olds also do not have an ID. And, to bring minorities into it, 25% of African American citizens of voting age lack a photo ID, whereas it's only about 8% of white people that lack a photo ID. Secondly, in-person fraud is rare. A recent study found that since 2000, there have been 31 credible allegations of voter impersonation, which is the only type of fraud that a photo ID would prevent. During this period, over 1 billion ballots were cast. Identified instances of fraud are honest mistakes. Cases of in-person impersonation, voter fraud, are often honest mistakes of those that are extremely rare. Voter ID laws are a waste of taxpayer dollars. The cost of educating the public, training poll workers, and providing IDs to voters all adds up. Following passage of voter ID law in Texas, they spent nearly $2 million on voter education and outreach efforts. In Indiana, over $10 million were spent to produce free ID cards between 2007 and 2010. Lastly, let's say that IDs are provided free of charge to citizens, which isn't likely. To obtain an ID, some people may need to pay for their birth certificate if theirs was lost. They might have to obtain other documents and then travel to the correct ID office. With travel, document fees, and waiting time, a free ID could still cost over $170 per person. Some people in rural Texas may live over 170 miles from their nearest issuing office, so for a family in Texas below the poverty line, the expenses would still be well over $350 to obtain free ID.
Thank you, Victoria. Interesting points. Not sure I agree with them, though, but I guess that's why we're here. Let's start with voter IDs disenfranchise minorities from voting. We need IDs to do a lot already in this country, right? You need an ID if you want to cash a check, if you want to buy cigarettes, if you want to buy alcohol, if you want to do all kinds of stuff. You already need an ID for. Are you saying these people aren't already doing these things?
Apparently. I mean, if they don't have IDs, then yeah, they're being held back in a number of different ways. But voting is included in one of those limitations.
Okay. So would you say that providing them with free IDs would actually be helping them in other areas of their life as well?
I'm sure it would help with other areas, but it still wouldn't be free. So with having to get a birth certificate and obtain other documents, as well as traveling to the ID office, that's still might not be a possibility for people.
To the ID office, there's a specific office in this hypothetical scenario that prints these IDs for them, is what you're saying?
Yeah, just like you have to go to the DMV, there are certain places you have to go to get your IDs.
I'm glad you brought that up, because my idea would also add this power to the DMVs, okay?
Okay.
I would let the DMV make these IDs, and I would call it the DMV&V. The Department of Motor Vehicles and Voting. And I think this would go a long way to solve some of these problems you're talking about, because there's a DMV everywhere.
Well, how close are the DMVs in rural areas?
Well, I used to live in a rural area, and closest DMV was 10 minutes away.
New Hampshire is somewhat rural. I would definitely give you that. There are other places that are worse.
That's true. Well, Texas is very big. I don't know specifically how far apart DMVs are, but I do know that there has to be a certain number per district or something, like within a certain area, right?
Mm-hmm. But I think, yeah, utilizing an office that we already have makes sense if this were to happen.
That's right. You heard it here first, folks. The DMV&V. It's going to work.
Trademark that.
It's going to work. I promise. Also, let's talk about how, despite these laws have already been passed in states like Texas, there have been record voting turnouts for, well, everybody across the board, but specifically in this case, minority groups who were supposed to be disenfranchised. Why do you think, in theory, they were going to be disenfranchised from voting, but in reality, their voting numbers have gone up after these laws have passed?
Are you saying after these laws have passed, like give me a year? Because if we're talking in recent elections, the numbers went up everywhere for everybody.
Yes, in the most recent elections, voting numbers were up across the board. And these voter ID laws had already been passed, which means they needed an ID to vote in these previous elections. And they did in record turnout.
Mm-hmm. The tricky thing about researching voter ID is that I found inconsistent statistics, right? Like I have numbers that voter ID laws drop in minority turnout in certain areas, that it really negatively impacts people's ability to cast their vote, and then you have alternative statistics. So I'm not sure. I mean, I can give you the numbers I have, but like it's just one of those things where like if you find the numbers you're looking for when you're researching.
Okay, but we do know from the last election alone, presidential election, that there were record turnout for everybody across the board, no matter what racial, gender groups, doesn't matter. Everyone had record turnouts, even in these states that have voter ID laws. That we know for a fact. Why do you think that is?
And weren't there also record claims of voter fraud?
Well, claims and reality are two different things. But that's another purpose of the voter IDs, is to give people confidence in elections again.
But people did not have confidence in this last election.
Well,
so is this really the solution we're looking for?
I could go off on a tangent about this, about The loser loves to claim there's some kind of fraud. I don't like this new tradition. Or whoever loses
I
the
don't like it
election,
either.
whoever loses the election gets to claim that there was some kind of problem with the system itself, right? That there was Russian interference, there was voter fraud. That's not the reality. But still, giving the American people confidence in elections is we shouldn't underestimate that.
But voter ID only prevents identification fraud. It's just one type.
Sure. What's wrong with that?
That it doesn't give people the confidence in our elections that I think you claim it does. It's only one way to fight fraud.
Still seems like a good way to me.
But if the goal is to use IDs to fight fraud, then I think we should just be clear about like what it's actually doing, that it's not like a cure-all or some like protection against any form. If people wanted to be fraudulent, they still could, right?
Well, I think a lot of people had a problem with the mail-in ballots in the last election, and so this wouldn't necessarily be a solution for that, but if there were some kind of voter ID laws, we may need to change how the mail-in ballot system works. I'm not sure what that would look like, but something may be different if these laws were to change.
Yeah, I think changes have already happened since the last election with mail-in ballots, right?
Yes, in some places.
Mm-hmm.
That's for sure. Again, because the confidence in our elections is low. And again, we have very secure elections. Let's just make that clear.
I agree with you there, yes.
Yeah. So you mentioned in one of your arguments that voter fraud is rare. And we just agreed that it is rare in this country.
Mm-hmm.
But let's remember there are 35 states that currently have voter ID laws in place. And so it's basically impossible for me to prove a negative, right? I can't tell you how much fraud IDs have prevented. There are no studies with that information. But what I can tell you is that if these IDs are free and easy to get, there will be no problems with them. And that it's likely that the 35 states that already have these laws in place are preventing fraud right now. And possibly a reason why the fraud numbers are so low.
Okay, so how have the IDs worked out in other states? Have they been provided for free? Are people having to obtain their own IDs? In Texas, you can use like your certificate to like have a concealed carry, but you can't use like your student ID. Like there's these voter ID rules are kind of wonky depending on where you are.
You're saying you can use a concealed carry permit as an ID.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that makes sense to me because when you apply for a concealed carry permit, they have to do all kinds of background checks and identity verifications and things. So that work has already been done if you show them that you have that ID, right?
But wouldn't your student ID for like college be just as legitimate?
I would say yes and no, right? Because non-citizens can attend our schools and get a student ID. And so we don't want non-citizens voting in our elections unless you're, of course, in New York State. But that's a discussion for another time.
Simmer down.
Yeah. So I can see why they made that decision. I would argue that they should let you get a voter ID with your student ID. Like they can use it as verification for you. But again, I think it's the citizenship issue, right? Like that's why they probably do it that way.
But in other states, you can just bring a bill addressed to your home. And that is proof of identification.
So
that you're like a local in that area.
Okay, so isn't that against your argument that minorities would have to go get a birth certificate when they could just show a bill from their house or residency to prove that?
In that one state, if we're going to pass this across the country, like how is this going to work? Because plenty of people have been turned away from the polls.
Right. So, I mean, I can't speak for everybody that's for voter IDs, but for me personally, I want to make it easy, right? Voting should be easy and it needs to be free. Mm-hmm. And so I would make it as easy as possible to get one of these voter IDs free of charge. I'm not against using a bill. I'm not against using student IDs. These things need to be verified, which takes a little time. But again, not all the state laws are perfect. I'm not arguing they are. I've not read all of them. I'm not familiar with all 35 of these laws. But I would argue for if there were a federal law, it needs to be easy for people to do and it needs to be free. And I don't foresee any problems with this, personally.
Maybe it could also be like mailed to your home or something if
Sure.
travel is a huge barrier for some people.
Sure, why not? We agree.
I think there are ways that the system needs to have like safeguards, that it is accessible and realistic for people to obtain, and being like a free ID is obviously, there's still costs to that, but if we could limit the added barriers, then I think there's a compromise here.
Would you say that our great compromise for the week is that, well, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it almost sounds like you would support voter IDs if they were easier to get, apply for, come in the mail, things along these lines. Is that true?
I could be persuaded if certain changes were made to how voter ID laws are being rolled out. I also think we agreed this episode on the minimal instances of fraud that really take place during our elections.
That's true. Russia isn't interfering. Mail-in ballots are safe. Voting is easy. Just go do it.
Yes, definitely go vote. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Great Compromise podcast. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We're now also on Instagram and YouTube. Find us there, and we'll see you next week.